Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Karlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. Today, it's our pleasure to present the 1952 crime film, Kansas City Confidential, directed by Phil Karlson and starring John Payne. Now, this is a heist film, but it's a heist film with a number of differences to it. It's very tightly edited, very intricately plotted, and I think interesting as an example of a B crime film from the 1950s. To discuss those issues and others, today we have joining us once again on City Cinematheque, Leonard Quart, a distinguished writer and historian of American and international film, as well as one of the editors of Cineaste Magazine. Now, enjoy the many pleasures of Kansas City Confidential. Welcome back to City Cinematheque, and welcome back from Kansas City via Mexico. This is a film that zigzags in a number of ways. I think there's enough to talk about those zigzags and a lot more. Joining us once again on City Cinematheque is our good friend Leonard Quart. Lenny has a retired professor from the City University of New York system. He's currently one of the editors and has been associated with for many years Cineaste Magazine. He's the author of numerous articles and of books, and in fact, he is now waiting for the publication of the fourth edition of American Film and Society since 1945, which is the kind of book that gets you invited to talk about a film from 1952 that's clearly related to a vision of American society. Welcome back, Lenny.
Thank you.
Good. Let's just start with the notion of the gangster as a character in American film. Obviously, the gangster, is always present in American film. We think of the great early 30s gangster pictures. We've got gangsters in this film. How has the gangster been debated by people like Robert Warshaw and others?
Well, Robert Warshaw, who died very early, wrote a book called The Immediate Experience. He was an editor of Commentary Magazine in its liberal days. And it was called, I can't recall the exact title, but it was about the gangster. He wrote an essay about the Western hero. And essentially, he was pushing the notion that in the 40s, late 40s and 50s, an optimistic America began to look for possibly, this is counter other points of view, for a nightmarish version of it. And
right.
The gangster represented a nightmarish, more brutal version, an underside to the American dream. It's not to say that the 50s didn't have other undersides.
Right, absolutely. The science fiction underside to
right.
something.
Or the Beat Generation
right.
as poetry, and literature. But he looked at it this way and chose the crime film. At least it's in that period. The great crime films were probably not made in the 50s. The great ones you mentioned, Scarface, Little Caesar, the Cagney films, were made in an earlier period. But there's a body of gangster films that sometimes blur with film noir.
Absolutely.
That came out in the 40s and 50s. And he viewed it in this context. He also talked about the gangster as a man of the city.
Right.
To be honest, there are other films that one can mention that really deal with the city and the gangster.
The city here is in the first movement of the film, and then it
drops out. It drops out. The city is the only location shooting in the film is shot, I think, Kansas City, and is the heist itself. The rest of the film is all studio sets.
Right. Well, it turns out that certainly that framing shot of the train station, which was one of the great, it still exists, by the way, it's one of the great centers of the crisscrossing of the country in that particular era. So we think of, one forgets the degree to which Chicago was a kind of secondary, Kansas City rather, was a kind of secondary Chicago in terms of industry. It's always smaller than Chicago, but also as a crossing point and as a cosmopolitan crossing point in the middle of the country. So let's go back to the gangster himself. What is it that he has as a set of characteristics that serves as this critique of American society?
Well, essentially, in this version, other
Yeah.
versions would give you a different conception. Essentially, he negates the dream. He chooses asocial methods of mobility. He chooses brutality rather than, let us say, insidiousness or other ways to make it in terms of mobility. He lacks, in this version, he lacks often the kind of hypocrisy and duplicity of other Americans pursuing the dream. He's more direct. And more direct in his, and undisguised in his desire for money and success. But the desire, the means are not, supposedly, are not the American means, the classic American means, especially defined in this particular optimistic moment in American history.
Well, let me put this in terms of the same character as interpreted by people coming from different, shall we call it, political or socioeconomic perspectives on America. So, if you're coming from the left, and particularly in the 30s, if you're coming explicitly from a Marxist point of view, then the gangster is actually the ideal American, because he's the person who, without hypocrisy, reveals the mechanisms of the economic system. Everything that he does, according to that point of view, everything that he does, everybody else does, but they find ways to mask it. And so he's the direct embodiment of the, homo economic, the man driven by the necessities of accumulation of wealth under capitalism. Now, that's the one point. The other, the other view of the same sort of thing is this is the person who misreads the safeguards of morality, citizenship, a sense of the betterment of society, and is the aberrant character, that the society actually has a system that works and has safeguards against it. So what's interesting here, I think, in this very specifically in this film, is the way in which it's revealed that Mr. Big, whom we assume, for the first section of the film, that he is a master criminal, and that is only what he is. And of course, in the incremental exposition of the film, it's revealed that he's a retired police captain.
Retired police captain who has been ostensibly framed and been pushed to resign from the force, played by a B actor, Preston Foster, who has a loving daughter and a loving relationship with his daughter. And yes, and he is obviously very smarter than anybody else in the film, has worked out supposedly a foolproof crime, one of those crimes that can never be discerned. And yes, he's a pipe-smoking, card-playing, but very sharp and very cool and rational, as different from the other gangsters who all have tics, a whole set of tics, played by if not B actors, actors who always played gangsters, Jack Elam, Lee Van Cleef, Neville Brand, a set of actors not idiosyncratic enough for me, but all with bulging eyes, with tics, murderous, semi-psychopaths, quivering, tense, anxiety-ridden, womanizing, but he is respectable. The Mr. Big is respectability itself. And of course, the whole thing in the film is the symmetry between our hero, who has also been framed for a crime he did not do, and Mr. Big. Our hero is an ex-con, suggested that he had a gambling problem and a gambling debt, but a war hero.
Absolutely.
Once an engineering student who was played by John Payne, once a song and dance man, then for 20th Century Fox, now a gangster, or played in action movies in the 50s. Westerns, and I remember gangster films. And he is, what's interesting about him, first of all, he's tough and snarling, and he always gets the drop almost always on the other gangsters, and one wants to know where he has learned how to handle himself so well in the world of crime, but he is a traditional hero.
Well, but I think you bring up two really interesting lines of discussion. One is the way in which you talked earlier about this everybody realizing that there's this darkening of American cinema in the post-war years, that there's been, a necessary but forced cheerfulness, largely in the war in the war years. I mean, with something like Raoul Walsh's his film about the down flyers, and is it Errol? I can't remember if it was Errol Flynn or Ronald Reagan. It's just I can hardly wait to get a crack at the Japs, as if it's the Boy Scouts fighting World War II. And so with this darkening. You get something in this parallel in somebody like Payne's career, that he really begins as you said, as the smiling young male ingenue, and as he ages into these parts in which he's swarthy. The close-ups in here emphasize the fact that he's not he's not 21 at all. He's an experienced person who has a certain bitterness about this. Now, the second line that's that's sort of interesting is the implication that while he is a war hero, and he's served his country very well, this is the kind of early people come back with a lot of things from war and a lot of skills, so he can, adapt these martial skills that he shows.
Yes, I thought of that as, of course.
But the thing is that the returning veteran is this ambiguous character, everything from celebrated and carried on the shoulders of Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland.
Or the best years of our lives, which of course treats it in a more complex, subtle fashion.
Absolutely, yes. But there's a whole range of it,
yeah.
And that includes, now we, in terms of American history and American film, the returned Vietnam veteran, perhaps almost most famously embodied by Travis Bickle in The Taxi Driver, becomes this image of the traumatized veteran. But this is the kind of film that just has a little hint of that in this character, and the fact that there has been, despite the fact that he served the country very well, might have gotten into some trouble. Why did he get into trouble? Was that trouble a consequence of trying to readjust and not being able to do so? So this is a film in which institutions, very interesting, the institutions that normally get celebrated are pretty deeply questioned and are shown to have betrayed a number of people.
I should add something here, that the police, before the Miranda rights are read, are utterly brutal and just use intimidation, coercion, coerce admissions, and are just seen without a tinge of following any kind of legal procedure. They are just brutes, and which also adds to it. The one thing I want to say, Jerry, in all these films is the danger often, and this brings us to it, of overinterpreting, taking every integer, every small aspect, and turning it into a more complex work than it is. This is a well-crafted heist movie. A skilled movie filled with actually very skilled reaction shots and close-ups.
Absolutely, yeah.
The close-ups are very. Carlson was basically a B-movie filmmaker. Phoenix City Story, Scandal Sheet Brothers, Rico. He was a B-movie maker, and I don't want to. It's maybe a cardinal principle, tenet of my criticism, not to overinterpret, not to interpolate meanings that aren't quite where the film is going. But you can, what you're saying is all very, very suggestive. And if you were taking the film as a sociological artifact, you'd probably turn it into these things about World War II, post-World War II adjustment, post-war. There's a counterman who he's obviously saved his life, who walks with a limp. So there's a whole thing about veteran connections and friendships and loyalties that are unbreakable.
Absolutely.
So there are interesting things here. Once we start talking, there are interesting things. When you watch it, to me, it is less interesting. But as we talk about it, there are always interesting things to say about a popular work.
And Carlson had a major influence over the television culture of the 1950s, because it was this film, along with very particularly Phoenix City Story, which is available on DVD if people want to take a look at it, which is about a corrupt gambling town, and the way in which there's the townspeople fight back against the kind of machine of corruption, which was shot on location. And it is the look of this stripped down B film, harsh look, that they recruited Karlson for the design of The Untouchables, because that is, and so it is, yes, he was the major consultant on the visual design of this, so that The Untouchables would not look like anything else, and would have, coming back to what you were talking about, would have a particular kind of two things. A particular kind of urban feel that had not shown up in the same way. Now it shows up in other things, in things like the comparable M Squad that people remember with Lee Marvin, etc. But location shooting for crime dramas, to be made for American television in the 50s and the early 60s, which is very, very different from this. So there's a way in which, the feature film and film noir and gangster film go in different direction, but this actually feeds into a different kind of popular American narrative. And, he does also have a sense of humor later in life, because this is the guy who does the Matt Helm films. With,
later on. You really know his oeuvre.
Well, with a name like Carlson, you would expect me to know a few.
That was his changed name.
Well, details, schmetails.
Yes. The one interesting thing, of course, another interesting thing is that the film noirs often think of Crossfire or Big Heat, always had interesting, elaborate relationships between men and women, femme fatales, heroines. The woman in this film is Coleen Gray, who I remember as a B movie star, but especially from my Darling Clementine. No, I got it wrong.
You got it wrong.
Oh, sorry.
She's actually, she pops up a couple of years later in another, which is terrific. She's the mousy girlfriend in The Killing with Stanley Kubrick. But let's go on about this. The male-female relationship.
In a sense, here it's almost an afterthought. There's a connection to our father. She's supposedly a law student. At first, the banter is so banal between her and John Payne that you just want to turn it off. Then she toughens. She becomes interested. She's going to save him. The film doesn't do much with any of it, but it's interesting in itself that this supposedly sweet lady is interested, young woman is interested in, maybe it's her relationship to a cop father, I don't know. But she says, it's my cop father, I was raised among cops, I want to help you, I want to pursue this case.
A couple of things to comment about that. One is, this is very early for a woman to be in law school. Now, of course, can she be in law school? Of course. I mean, legally, blah, 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 blah. But you have to understand that this is, remember the battles of the 70s. Right. I mean, even in Gary Trudeau's cartoons about the fact that women are now invading law schools, and the really kind of backdoor battles that were being fought as to whether or not women would be really admitted into certain kinds of law firms. One of my friends was the first woman to be offered a partnership at a Wall Street law firm that was 150 or 200 years old. And this is in, only 30 years ago. So what's interesting about that, just in terms of the design of the story, is that she has none of the, she feels her father was wrong, but she has no institutional bitterness, that she's going to go on and perform the mission that her father did. And her father is sort of, is a split character. He's investing all of his goodness in her. Yeah. And then the dark side that he's seen and known as a police captain, he's now using. And you're going to disapprove of what I'm about to do. This is a film that, like, The Heart of Darkness by Conrad, ends with the necessary lie. What protects the idealism of a number of people in society? I mean, the father says, don't let her know anything about this.
So there is a necessary lie in a world where betrayal isn't the norm. Every one of the minor criminals, the thugs, most of them try to betray each other. These are people bound by betrayal, bound by corruption. There's an interesting performance by Jack Elam as Pete Harris, who is twitching and a gambler who owes big debts and is willing to betray anybody and everybody, but is actually very physically weak and is a weak character, and it's very, very curious. I mean, not unique. I mean, the film noir was built on the nature of corruption, but the only noirish elements in here, there are a couple of shots of alleyways. There's an element of a dark night street in Mexico, but essentially the formal elements in noir aren't quite part of this film. It's mostly in the light.
Absolutely, but the other thing is that much of the violence, I mean, there are deaths in film noir, there's setups, but but frequently the violence is psychological. It
Absolutely.
may have here where the physicality of violence is actually emphasized in this film, and for its era. Now we're in the sort of, you know, we're almost 50 years beyond Bonnie and Clyde and the Wild Bunch and the kind of revolution in violence of the late 60s and early 70s. So when we backtrack to 1952, the physicality of the violence in this film is actually a very strong element of it. For example, just as you were saying, when the Lee Van Cleef character betrays the Neville Brand character, I mean, we see, you know, the impact of the bullets, and he fires into his body multiple times. And we have the when John Payne and Van Cleef are fighting, we have those extreme close-ups,
right,
you know, of this. So that descent into this world of the physicality of violence is something that the film marks very strongly.
But the interesting part, though, these characters, I wanted to say there was another theory about the gangster and the gangster film, but not the film. Daniel Bell, a great sociologist and social critic, taught at Columbia, wrote a book called The End of Ideology and wrote about crime as the American way of life. Now, it's, in a sense, it inverts the Warshau's notion because his conception, because he's using crime as a rational enterprise, crime as the mafia, crime as a way of pursuing the American dream, as a rational conception where everything's been rationalized. Crime in his conception, because it's the 50s, is built around consumption rather than production. It is less the earlier elements of crime. This is a crime where the criminal enterprise folds into the respectability and searches for it. How true it was is always a question, because remember, the 50s is the period of the Crime Commission, so crime was on people's minds.
Right.
But to be honest, crime in the 50s was comparatively minimal than crime in the 80s and 90s in America. If you think about it, crime in that period was relatively low.
Well, and you think of films that have portrayed, you know, demographic movements. You have movies like Jonathan Demme's Married to the Mob, or Scorsese's famously Goodfellas, in which the city is deserted because everybody has fled to the suburbs.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
And then witnessed so many years later, The Sopranos. The end of the opening montage of The Sopranos very famously is pulling into the luxurious suburban home, not the urban mansion of the.
So the parallel, the suburbs, which are what the 50s became the icon of the 50s, the mythos of the 50s, where supposedly the gangster film was undermining that conception of harmony and serenity. It's the gangsters ultimately want to end up in the suburbs of Leave It to Beaver, essentially.
Well, and so that's actually, you know, that's part of what I would call the equivocal false ending of this film, where the necessary lie has been told, and so do they move back and she becomes a successful DA, and Dad takes the kids, you know, to school, and nobody ever knows that essentially there's this kind of cultural amnesia there, that everybody moves forward with the American dream, and all of that messy stuff from the past, whether it be Dad being framed as a police officer, the brutality of the services, the war, it all kind of, you know.
In writings about the film, it's always mentioned that it does search or contrives an optimistic ending. It tries to provide us, at least the audience, the undiscerning audience, that all is well in the world. All is knitted together, despite all that has preceded it, everything that has preceded it, all the corruption and destruction that's preceded it.
Well, and that, and that is, I've mentioned the phrase already, that is this tradition that, again, somebody like Hitchcock is also a master of, and that's the false happy, the false happy ending. I mean, very famously, we have the end of Psycho, in which we have a psychological explanation of the serial killer.
An embarrassing one, actually.
Absolutely. But then we have this whole notion that it's supposed to be wrapped up, and yet the stuff is coming out of the muck. So I think this is part of, you bring up something interesting, that there's a pull that the tradition says, God, we got to wrap up all the plot stuff, and we've got to make it happy for all of them. But there's a subversive tradition of saying, well, let's make this a double level.
Right.
Let's make this a split level thing. The people who want to believe that thing, fine, and the people who want to see how this is really mixed, or this is a lie.
And he's getting the insurance money, which is interesting, is he not?
Yes, yeah.
He's getting the insurance money to live a happy life, supposedly. And does he merit the insurance money? That's another question.
No, but
itself.
that's all part of the complexity, and then the insurance agent even says, I'll vouch for him at any point. Now, Lenny, I'm going to have to say that I'll vouch for you anytime on this show, because we've come to the end of where we are in our discussion. Time flies when you're talking about crime, my friend. So, if you'd like to know more about City University Television, City Cinematheque, or this particular series, let me suggest that you do what we all do these days: go on the internet. Go to www.cuny.tv. There you'll find information about all the programming at City University Television, and there's a pull-down menu in which you can find information very specifically about this series, City Cinematheque. You'll also, no surprise, find click-ons so you can communicate with us by email. We always welcome your comments, and you can join our e-list to be updated for the screenings here on City Cinematheque. So please visit www.cuny.tv. Len, always a pleasure having you here. Always a lively discussion, my friend. And we look forward to having you again, and maybe we'll go to Europe the next time, another place that you visit with your critical imagination.
Thank you.
Okay, great. And thank you for joining us here today on City Cinematheque as we stroll through the archives of film history. Please tune in again and watch more here at CUNY TV. Bye-bye for today.